There are 3 accounts of Paul's conversion found in the book of Acts. They're all a bit different, and because of that, some critics say that they're at odds with each other. Comparing them, New Testament critic Bart Ehrman writes, "The 3 accounts differ in numerous contradictory details. Clearly, we are dealing with a narrative that has been molded for literary reasons, not with some kind of disinterested historical report. If Luke can't keep from contradicting himself while telling and retelling Paul's conversion, this would cast a doubt on if he ever traveled with or even knew Paul very well at all. Let's take a look at Bart's complaints one by one and see if he has a good case against Luke. Here's Dr. Ehrman's first alleged contradiction. He writes, on 3 occasions, Acts narrates the conversion of Paul on the road to Damascus, chapters 9, 22, and 26. Compare them closely to one another and you will find very odd contradictions. In chapter 9, Paul's companions hear the voice of Jesus talking to Paul, but they don't see anyone. In chapter 22, they see light, but don't hear anything. Which is it? Here are the verses in question. Acts 9:7 reads, the men who were traveling with him stood speechless, for they heard the voice but could see no one. Acts 22:9 reads, my companions saw the light but did not hear the voice of the one who spoke to me. 2 things need to be noted about these verses. For starters, the exact forms of the word hear, akuo, are not used in both cases. Let's take a look at the context a bit. Acts 9:4 uses the word akuan in the accusative, which means they heard the sound of a voice. In Acts 22:9, akuantes in the genitive can mean understand the voice, as the NIV, ESV, and New American Standard Bible translate it. So when this verse is properly understood, there's actually no real contradiction. Paul's companions heard the sound of the voice but didn't understand what it said. And if you think about it, we've all experienced this at one time or another. A week doesn't go by in my house without either of my kids or me saying from another room, I can't hear you. We didn't understand what they said despite hearing their voice. Luke uses the same word in the same manner elsewhere. For example, in Luke 6:27 it says, but I say to you who hear, clearly he's referring to people who understand what he's saying. This is not about the plain meaning of the text as Ehrman makes it out to be, rather it's a question about interpretation. But Ehrman has more objections. He writes, in chapter 9, the companions are left standing while Paul falls to the ground. In chapter 26, they are all knocked to the ground. Which is it? Let's take a look at the verses for ourselves. Acts 9:7 reads, the men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice but seeing no one. Acts 26:14 says, and when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in Hebrew, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? So what exactly is going on here? Well, the phrase stood speechless is possibly only an idiomatic expression that suggests that they were frozen in their tracks, not that they were standing up the entire time. But let's consider the very worst case scenario here. Variations in small detail are common in the testimony of honest eyewitnesses. Can the points of difference here be so strong and so decisive that it's impossible or at least difficult to attribute them to ordinary causes like inattention or forgetfulness? This is hardly enough to cause us to doubt the robust reliability of the book of Acts. But Dr. Ehrman has one more gripe about the accounts. He writes, in chapters 9 and 22, Paul is told to go to Damascus to be instructed by a man named Ananias about what to do next. In chapter 26, Paul is not told to be instructed by Ananias. Instead, Jesus himself instructs him. Well, which is it? Notice that in Paul's speech to Agrippa in Acts 26, Paul doesn't say that Jesus told him not to go. Luke's Christian audience may have been familiar with Ananias and interested in the story, and so they get a lot of the details in chapter 9. But in chapter 22, when Paul is speaking to the Jews, Ananias is described as a devout man according to the law, having a good report of all the Jews. Paul's clearly adapting to his audience. But why would King Agrippa care about some random Jewish Christian? This omission of Ananias in Luke's account of Paul's speech is not a declaration of the opposite. He's just keeping to the facts that Agrippa would actually care about. Ehrman says that these 3 accounts seriously undercut Luke's reliability, but this criticism just seriously fails to land. If anything, we find that upon closer inspection of Acts 9, 22, and 26, the variations line up very nicely with what we know about Paul's circumstances. This should boost our confidence in Luke. Allow me to explain why. For this argument, I am leaning on the work of the 19th century scholar J.S. Housen. In both of these speeches, Paul leaves out facts that would have been interesting to Luke as the narrator, but less so to Paul's audience. These details would include that Paul didn't eat for several days after his experience on the road to Damascus, and when he was healed, scales fell from his eyes. Before the Jerusalem mob, Paul paints himself as a zealous and devout Jew in order to keep their attention and make them more favorable to himself. He respectfully calls his audience brothers and fathers, and Paul emphasizes his own rabbinic education under Gamaliel. He also highlights the Jewish devotion of Ananias who came to him in Damascus. Rather than calling Ananias a Christian, he says that he was a man who was devout by the standard of the law. Paul very skillfully puts off the use of the word Gentiles throughout his entire speech until he has a chance to tell his testimony. For example, in Acts 22:15, he tells them that Ananias told him that the God of our fathers has sent him to be a witness to all men. When Paul finally lets the cat out of the bag by acknowledging that Jesus sent him to the Gentiles, the crowd erupts in riot, but he holds out as long as he can. In stark contrast, Paul omits any mention of Ananias before Agrippa and Festus. Again, why would they care about an obscure Jew from Damascus? Paul emphasizes more than once to Agrippa and Festus that it is the Jews who are opposing him here. Now, suddenly the Jews are the bad guys. In contrast, Paul calls Christians saints. He admits that he tried to force them to blaspheme, a self-accusation that fits very well with Paul's own self-blame that we read about in his letters. Paul mentions to Agrippa and Festus that the voice from heaven spoke to him in a Hebrew dialect, probably Aramaic. This casual indicator tells us that Paul is speaking Greek now, as there would be no reason to mention a similar linguistic point to the Jewish audience in chapter 22, where it's noted that Paul is speaking to the crowd in a Hebrew dialect. Paul said that he became all things to all men, and we see this in action here. Luke's accurate access to Paul's words on these events and his impressively careful documentation of them explain these seemingly insignificant and small touches quite well, even if they are only summaries. This raises an interesting question. If Luke was so knowledgeable and conservative in recording Paul's speeches, is it really probable that Luke would invent several of Jesus' speeches or deliberately alter them? Various scholars tell us that he felt free to do so, but this evidence seems to counter that claim. The same would hold true for his reporting of Peter's speeches in Acts, which include Peter testifying about the apostles eating and drinking with Jesus after he rose from the dead. Remember previously that Bart Ehrman implied that Luke is a bit of a bungler. He's not writing a disinterested report, he's molding a story for literary reasons, but he can't seem to keep his story straight in the process. But we see that if he's haphazardly making up a story about Paul's conversion, he's also being very carefully devious at the same time. It seems to me that critics can't have it both ways. Luke is either an incredibly sloppy historian, or a literary mastermind who embellished the facts, or a highly reliable reporter. I think that option 3 makes the most sense of the data. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you found this video helpful. Please be sure to like and subscribe.